Income Tax 2020. Tax software example W-2 income. Come in, relax with Income Tax 2020. Here we are in our Lacerte tax software. You don't need the Lacerte tax software to follow along, but we're going to practice with the software to put in the data input within it, then jump over to the tax forms, which of course will be the Form 1040 to see the impact of that data input on the Form 1040. Obviously, the software makes it a little bit easier for us to jump back and forth and enter different things into the system. So we're going to start off with our single taxpayer and just one W-2 form and enter that into the system here. So let's go on over. This is going to be kind of a mock W-2 form that we will be using. We just filled it out in Excel, just the basics of it, so that we can concentrate mainly on the actual numbering of it, boxes 1 through, say, 12B that we'll be considering here. So here's our first W-2 with the $40,000 of the wages, federal income tax withheld $4,000, Social Security also $40,000 on the wages side, amount withheld $2,480, Medicare taxes $40,000, and the Medicare withheld $580. Now notice in general, when we think about the withholdings, they should kind of make sense most of the time, except when there's kind of weird circumstances. And in 2020, there were some weird things going on as they tried to make benefits for the problems for the coronavirus deal. But normally, notice this $40,000, I can't tie directly to the federal income tax withheld. I don't really know what the federal income tax is based on just the wages, because it was based on the W-4 that was filled out, and it's too complex to be standardized. It's not a flat tax, in other words. So, but the Social Security, we should have an idea. We should be able to say that's kind of like a flat tax. So basically, if I took the $40,000 here times 0.0625, we can have an idea of what it should be, what that calculation is. Let's do that again. 40,000 times 0.062 is 2,480. The same with the Medicare. It's a flat kind of tax, and therefore it should be correct. The withholding should be done already. This should be just an informational purpose to put those into place. So 40,000 times 0.0145, we're going to say is the 580. So just to look at the W-2, you can kind of make sense of the withholdings typically, because of the nature of the Social Security, and Medicare should be more of a flat tax type nature, a flatter tax at least. And the wages up here for the federal income tax are going to be the taxes that are more complex. They're not going to be something that's a flat tax. So let's go ahead and input this into the system. I'm going to go, all right, let's go over to Lacerte here. We're going to go into the data input. I'm going to go into the income and wages and just fill this out. And I'm just going to call this employee, employer. And so now if it was a married couple, we might want to say whether it is the spouse or not. As we do the data input, it could have some impacts on the tax calculation, but normally not, but it could possibly. Retirement plan, is there a retirement plan or not? So we're going to say that's going to be typically here on box 13. So if we have a retirement plan, we want to check that off. Why is that relevant? Well, if they have a retirement plan, we might say, they've already either put money into the retirement plan or not at their work. They can't go back and put money in there. We can make advice about them putting money into it, or if they haven't put enough in, they may still be able to qualify for an individual retirement plan, and that's one of the last kind of tax planning type things that you can do. But you got to make sure that you pick up the correct, whether they're eligible for a retirement plan, so that the tax software can help you out to determine whether or not they may still be able to put money into an IRA account and possibly get a tax benefit even now, even after year end, because we would be doing this basically in 2021 for the 2020 tax return. So then we're going to go to the wages over here and say the wages we said were the 40,000, so 40,000 on the wages. Now watch what populates by the software on this side when I just put 40,000 into wages. 40,000, I hit tab. We got the Social Security wages then populated at 40,000. That'll typically be correct. And then we have the Social Security withheld now at the 2,480, which is correct, right? That's what we have there. And the system could calculate it automatically. How did the system know that? Didn't see the W-2 over here. It knew it because it's a flat tax. So we should be able to calculate it easily because it is a flat tax. Medicare wages populated automatically. That may be the same. It could be different depending on the circumstances. But once we have that Medicare wages that then calculated the Medicare withheld, which is going to be the 580 correctly. If we had any state tax, then we would put the state tax and the local and the SDI here. Note that you also need the information down below, including the employer identification number, which would be picked up from the W-2. I'm not going to put a lot of, we put an employee's number and employer number would be here. I'm not going to change the employer identification number for the practice problem, but note that you're going to need that. The IRS wants that information now. The employer state ID, so we got the state ID number here, and then state ID verified, the name, and then they typically do want the address. So then we have the address down here, wages, and then you got the wages information and some more data input with regards to other items that could be on the W-2. So this is going to be the basic information. This is where we'll start. Let's see what the impact will be then on the taxes. If I go on over to the form 1040, then we have the $40,000 in the wages now. If we go on down to the total income is there, and we don't have any adjustments to income on the Schedule 1. So we have no items in line 10 here. That's going to give us then to box 11, the adjusted gross income. And then we have the standard deduction or itemized deduction. We're at the $15,000. And that's because we entered something into the itemized deduction. So I'm going to delete that and say we don't have anything in itemized and just pick up the standard deduction here. So I'm going to go back on over to itemized for interest and remove that. Back on over to the tax form. So there we have it. So now we're at the standard deduction to $12,004, and that's going to give us the total income of the $27,600. If I enter that into our worksheet here, we'd say, okay, I've got the $40,000, and that's going to give us the standard deduction for a single taxpayer, $12,004. That brings us down to the $27,600. That's going to be the $27,600. So that's how I would think of that. Then if we go to page 2, we'll basically be calculating the tax on it, coming out to that $3,118. So let's put that over here. We're going to say $3,118, $3,118. And then we had the amount of payments that we had. So the payments are going to be down below in our calculation, and the amount that was withheld. Let's go back on over to the detail. I don't think I put the payments in. Income, wages, we've got the amount withheld that I didn't put in here, which is going to be the $4,000. So notice that $4,000 then is what's going to be what we're kind of concentrating on primarily with regards to the 1040, because that's the federal income tax withheld. Going to page 2 then, there's the $4,000 that was withheld, bringing us to the refund of the $882. So if I go into my worksheet here, I'd go into then I'd say, okay, payments. I'm going to say payments for the W-2 was $4,000. And then if I go back on over, I'd say, okay, there's the tax calculation I got from the software. $4,882 is going to be what the refund is. And we can kind of verify as we go basically on the tax return as well. Now, notice this information here with regards to the Social Security wages, the Medicare wages, the Social Security tax, and Medicare tax, with regards to this reporting isn't really affecting the Form 1040 at this point, but it's informational type purposes. So we're still putting it in place, but it's not affecting the federal income tax calculation because, once again, the Social Security and Medicare taxes that were paid will typically be correct and not something that needs to be adjusted, although there could be circumstances where that is not the case. Now, if I go into the tax worksheets over here on the forms, then I do see the employer wages, federal withheld, FICA, and Medicare. So we have the FICA and Medicare here, even though they're not really having an impact on the Form 1040, the calculation for the federal income tax. Now, in Lacerte, you can also kind of go to the 1040 and jump to that worksheet here, and you'll see the information for the federal income tax, FICA, and Medicare. But again, what's going to be on the 1040? Generally the federal income tax information, including the federal income tax and the federal wages that are withheld. All right, let's take a look at another one. We're going to go down and say, okay, what about this one? Now we're at the $150,000 for box 1. We're at the cap for the Social Security because we hit the cap, and the Medicare's at the $150,000 as well. And here's going to be our federal income tax withheld. The Social Security now is at this capped amount, times 0.062, which is basically a flat tax or a flatter tax. And this is going to be the Medicare wages times 0.0145. Let's put that into our tax return here. I'm going to go back on over. And we're going to say, all right, well, let's say this was 150,000, and let's see what happens to these boxes once I change this. It changes automatically. Capped it at 137.7, even without me inputting it, and it calculated the correct Social Security. The Medicare it put at the 150,000, even though we did nothing, and calculated then the correct tax on at the 2,175. That 2,175 tying out to here, that 8,537 also tying out as well. So that's because it's a flat tax that you can do that. You can't do that with the federal taxes. We have to take that from the W-2. That's going to be then the 37,500 in our case. We're going to say, okay, this is going to be 37,500. And there we have that. Once again, we would need to populate all this information down below for the tax return as well. Then I'm going to just basically for the information, employer identification, and so on, address. And then I'm going to go back on over. Let's see the impact now on the tax return. We, of course, have the 150,000 in box 1. If I select the worksheet, then we're going to get the detail, wages, federal income tax, FICA, Medicare, closing that back out. Then we have the 12,400 standard deduction. That brings us to the 137.6 taxable income. I can then verify that on our worksheet, which I would say, okay, I'm going to enter the box 1 federal income tax, 150,000, and then I'd go back over. There we have that. That brings us to the 137.6, which I can tie out there. That makes sense. And then I'd say, okay, the amount that was withheld for federal income tax, 37.5. I can put that into my worksheet. I can say, okay, this should be 37.5, 37.5, and then I'm going to bring that over to the first page. So I would think refund 34,382. So I'm going to say, all right. Oh, well, I didn't put the right tax in. So then I'm going to go to page 2, calculate the tax 27,104, which I'm going to get from the tax return. So that's going to be this number, 27,104. So we have verified basically this number, the 137.6. We use the software then to calculate the tax, and then we're going to put in from the W-2 the amount of withholdings down here, and that should then help us to kind of give a double check on the refund calculation, which is going to be then the 10,396, and that's going to be the 10,396. So that looks good. We can also see this in the tax summary here in this format. So we verified the 137.6, the 137.6 that we calculated separately. Then we took this number from the tax return, and then we took this number separately. And so we kind of verified it in that format. Okay, let's take a look at another one. I'm going to go back on over and say, all right, well, let's say that these 3 boxes are different now. And let's say we have 140 in box 1 for the federal income tax, 35,000 withheld. Social Security still capped at 137.7, which gives us the 8,537 because it's a flat tax. 150,000 for the Medicare wages, that gives us a tax at 2,175. The difference between box 5 and box 1 is what was put into a 401k, which is going to be this 10,000. Now, when you get into these box 12 items, you might have some things and you might be questioning, well, what is that? I don't know what it is. Well, typically there'll be a letter next to it. It says there's a D or a double D or something like that. And you can look, and usually if you have the actual W-2, you'll have instructions on it, which will give you instructions for the boxes here. So you can take a look at that. It'll look like this. For example, a D here, then that we have on the box. We're going to say it's an elective deferral to a Section 401k, cash or deferred arrangement. So you can take a look at some of these other items, a double D, cost of employer-sponsored health coverage, and so on and so forth. So you can review some more of this information on the instructions. So anything you have a question about, you should be able to find it on the instructions. Now, if you only have like the first page of the W-2, you can go to the IRS website and just simply search for a W-2 type form. And then within the W-2 form, there's instructions on it, or you can search for W-2 instructions. But if you look at the actual form, usually it'll give you the back of the form, which are these instructions here. So you've got the instructions there, And you've got the instructions for the employee. So here's the box 12 instructions. And then you also have these instructions for the employee as well that you can kind of review. So if there's anything funny going on, they should be in those instructions. Okay, so if we put this back in, we're going to say, all right, then this is going to be 140,000. And let's see what happens to these boxes when I hit tab. I'm going to say, all right. Then it populated this one at the 137.7, which is correct. It populated this one at the 140,000. Now the Medicare is incorrect, and it couldn't know otherwise because box 1, it's basing it on box 1, right? So we're going to say, all right, this needs to be 150,000. Once I do that, then Medicare should be calculated correctly here. The federal income tax, I'm going to say, all right, federal income tax was 35,000. So I'm going to say 35,000 here. And then now that we have the Social Security at the 8537 and the 2175. So that's calculated by the computer. 8537, 2175, that's correct. And then we need to go down to box 12 and put that 10,000 in there. So I'm going to say, all right, box 12. So I go down to box 12. And I'm going to say, I'll put in 12A. I'm going to say this is D, a 401k plan, the amount of 10,000. Now notice that this amount in box 12 may not have an impact on the actual tax calculation, but it's informational purposes because the IRS is going to want to know, well, why is there a difference between the wages here and the wages for Medicare? And that difference is going to be box 12 because it's the deferral. So the actual tax calculation will be calculated up top, but that added information is necessary for the IRS to basically know why the tax calculation is calculated the way the tax calculation is calculated. So then if I go back up to the forms and say, all right, what's this going to do? We're going to then say that we now have 140,000 in the wages, checking on this box. We then have the wages, federal tax, FICA, Medicare, closing that back out. Then we have the standard deduction at 12,400, bringing us now to the 127.6. So if I put that into my worksheet over here, I'm going to say, okay, now we're at wages. Box 1 wage is 140,000. And I said that the payments, we said were 35, was it? We said the payments were 35,000. So I'm going to say 35,000. Going back on over to the tax form. So I'm going to see if I can verify that number. 27,600 for the taxable income. Bottom line, 127,600 and 127,600. Then I'm going to rely on the tax return to calculate the tax. So I'm going to say, now that we know the tax, now that we agree on the taxable income, what do you say the tax is? 24,704. So I'm going to say, all right, 24,704. 24,704, and then I relied on the W-2 to data input the payments, 35,000. So I believe we should be able to verify now at 10,296 as basically the refund. So 35,000 for the federal income withheld. That's going to give us the 10,296, and that's how we can kind of verify that out. Okay, so now let's say that they're married and they have we got two W-2s that we're going to be dealing with now. So let's put that first W-2 back in and say, okay, let's go back up and put this other W-2 in and say we've got 2 now, or they have 2 jobs. You might have multiple, you got to have a lot of W-2s. So then we're going to go back on over and say, okay, now I'm going to add another one. And this, I'm just going to call it employer again. And let's say this is a spouse item. And then I'm going to say, okay, here. And I'll say employer 2. Employer 2. All right. And then we're going to pick up our information. We're going to say, all right, this is going to be for 40,000. 40,000. Let's actually change the marital status first. So I'm going to go to the client information. I'm going to change it from single to married filing joint. And then we're going to go back over to our income information. And I'm going to say this was 40,000. And so that populates. These are correct now. They did that for me. And then I'm going to say that this was 4,000 withheld. 4,000 was withheld there. Okay. And then I'm going to go back on up and say, let's see what that does. And I'll say, okay, so now we're at married filing joint. here we have the 2 taxpayers, and now we're at the 180,000. Now, if I was to verify this, it's harder to do so just going to the tax return. This is where the worksheet helps out. I'm going to say, all right, well, I had one here. Let me see if I could double check that. Then I had 40,000 from the other W-2. So I'm going to try to double check this on my other worksheet here. And then I withheld 4,000 on that one. So I'm going to say, all right, 4,000 withheld. So I would think then, if I go back to page 1, that the wages should be 180,000. Then we should now have a standard deduction of 24,000. So I should be able to get down to taxable income of 155,200. And then I'm going to delete the tax, and if I get there, so we're going to say 180,000 and then 24,800 now. And that gives us then our taxable income 155,200. That's just what we thought it would be. So there, that's good. Then I'm going to rely on the software to calculate the tax on page 2, 25,724. So I'm going to say, all right, that's going to be 25,724. And then I relied on the W-2s to calculate the payments of 39,000. So I think we should be able now to double check and verify the 13,276 as the refund. Obviously, I'm just kind of making these numbers up, so the refunds could be higher, it could be higher or whatever. But so then I'm just going to say that we had the payments then of the 39,000. So there's the 13,276 here on the refund. So that's how you can kind of go about doing that. Notice, of course, again, once you have multiple W-2s, that's where the worksheet kind of helps out, because you want to verify, you want to double check that you have everything correct. And if you don't have a worksheet, then what you're going to end up doing is having all your W-2s lined up, and you're going to have to add them all up. I'm going to add box 1, box 1, box 1, box 2, box 2, box 2. It's easier to do that by doing it separately in another Excel worksheet, and then you can have your double check in that format. And I think it'll be a little bit faster to do.